So a persistent identifier is an identifier, a label which gives you a unique name or label to an entity, person, place, or thing. They are long-lasting if they are persistent. Yeah, I did already tell you what an identifier is. We're going to do it again. An identifier is a unique string of characters assigned to something, someplace, or someone that can be used to identify it. The social insurance number, driver's license number, Medicare, license plate, student number. We're assigned these things all the time. We carry ID. We provide IDs more or less constantly for folks who are asking for them. Identifiers typically refer to physical objects and are often created and managed locally. So for example, UMB student ID, only really useful in the UMB context. I can't take this to a hospital or my government and have them know or care about what that number means. But internally, they're useful for record keeping, retrieval, searchability, and they're useful for disambiguation. Social insurance numbers provided federally, Medicare provided provincially, a license plate number, only a label for a current registered car. And again, there is more than one Mike Nason in Canada. And I say this, I joke about it a lot. The number of Michael Nasons who I get email from is frankly upsetting. A lot of them drive Jeeps, and a lot of them are looking for insurance packages. But only one of these Michael Nasons has my social insurance number, or at least I hope so. DOIs are identifiers. DOI is an acronym for Digital Object Identifier. Did you spend 3 slides telling me what an ID is? Not once, but twice. So PIDs share all of the same benefits. They're good for disambiguation, data retrieval, searchability. We scratched the surface a bit on what a DOI does. This URL storage redirection. That's just one benefit for one kind of PID. There are lots of kinds of PIDs. So, as I was saying, I might write my own name as Mike Nason, Michael Nason, Michael Thomas, William Nason, M Nason, M. Nason, or a Hem Nason if it's a handle. And there may be more than one of literally any of these. So, you know, as I said before, there's more than one Mike Nason, there's more than one Michael Nason. I'd be really surprised if there were a lot of Michael Thomas William Nasons, but there may be. And certainly there's way more M. Nason because the M could mean a million different things, which is why that's a really bad way to list your name in a publication. The more variations and folks with the same name there are, the harder it is to find the stuff I've done. A PID for people would make attribution and discovery easier. So every time I, publish a work, if there's a PID that is very unambiguously me, not some other M. Nason. People are looking for my work and they search for M. Nason. They're going to see a bunch. It's going to be hard to find me. If they have a PID associated with me, well, they can get right to me. So what about persistence? Persistent identifiers most frequently refer to digital things. So traditionally, when we're sharing digital things or locating digital things, we use a link, a URL. We're very familiar with these. URL stands for Uniform Resource Locator. They are colloquially referred to as like web addresses. A lot of people don't know that they're called URLs. That's what they're called. And here's an example, .com/index.html. We know that URLs break all the time and for lots of different reasons. The content moves or is stale, the service provider disappears, all kinds of reasons. We're very familiar with a 404 error. It means that the website is no longer where the link said it was supposed to be. A URL can tell you where something was when you read it. So if you bookmark that URL or you put it in print, which people have been doing for years in publications in their bibliography, they've been putting URLs in print, you're assuming that that'll still work later. This is absolutely not guaranteed and increasingly not guaranteed. Like websites are pretty ephemeral in a lot of ways. People refer to this thing where you try to visit a link where something's dead as link rot, where these things just kind of disappear. But as we discussed earlier, if I use a DOI, I can update the location if the content moves. I can provide a persistent link to a record that contains a URL. The ID is persistent. Where it directs me may change. So DOIs are persistent and where they resolve may change. I hand somebody that DOI and I just update where the URL points. The URL dies, I update the registration, and now it points to the new place that content is. So imagine finding the citation for this work in a bibliography. We've got a great big honking URL, Taylor and Francis books, mono, and then coincidentally the DOI is part of their URL. Metadata Richard Smiraglia, or the one that just has the DOI. The one with just the DOI is going to be more useful for longer than the one that is the full URL. So that's a bit about DOIs. I'm going to talk about Orchid for a second. So Orchid stands for Open Researcher and Contributor ID. Orchid is also the name of the not-for-profit organization that provides Orchid IDs and maintains the service and develops the website and the API. And we'll talk about APIs down the road. If you're the kind of person who's bothered when people say PIN number, you'll hate Orchid. No one says Orc IDs. Some people do, but they're wrong. What is an ORCID? We typically call them either ORCID IDs or ORCIDs. ORCIDs are a kind of PID. They're PIDs for people. First and foremost, ORCID IDs help consistently and properly identify the authors of works, no matter what their name is, was, or will be. Nearly every publisher can take an ORCID ID as metadata associated with the publication, and this metadata can save people time. So if I'm publishing in a place and I want to upload, say, my current affiliation and my current name, I can put in my ORCID ID and they can pull that information and just ends up in the form automatically. It's important to note that one of the things we really have a bad time addressing in name metadata, and I talked about this a little bit in the off, the stuff that got cut off is like, you know, my name, Michael Thomas William Nason, I normally get one middle name field. Or people who are from other cultures who are asked to put their name in a first and last name field can't fill in the metadata the way that they would expect to. Or last names have different meanings in different cultures. But it's also true that names change. People get married, people transition. You know, there are lots of immigrants use like transliterations of their name, or they just pick a localized name that's easier to pronounce so they don't have to like deal with white people saying it's too hard to pronounce your name. So they end up, you know, publishing under those names. But an ORCID ties all of that stuff into one person. It kind of doesn't matter what your name is anymore because that ORCID has all of your work in it, no matter what you sort of put your name in as. So no matter what your name is, was, or will be, an ORCID will help identify that work. So again, this example, and then at the bottom, I put what would lead to my ORCID record. So it doesn't really matter what I put in my name metadata. The ORCID can cover all of those things. ORCID also provides users with what's known as an Orcid Profile. This is a lot of what we'll talk about in the back half of the session today. When you hear someone talk about a scholar profile or a researcher profile, they're probably talking about ORCID, Scopus ID or Researcher ID or Google Scholar. But they might be talking about something else entirely. Sometimes when people say I have a researcher profile, they just mean they have a website they update once a year. I've done a handful of talks on this, and I've got links in the slide, and we can provide the slide notes later. But if people are curious about profiles, you can learn more. So persistent identifiers, they make things easier to find and track, share, and access, right? They do all of these things. And that's, you know, not just you click a link and you get to the place, but they do all of these other things as well. So persistent identifier, a unique, unchanging identifier representing an object, digital or otherwise, that can direct a user unambiguously to that object's current location. But PIDs can't just do this by themselves. I can write a DOI, but it doesn't matter if I don't have this other piece. PIDs require a third party. So folks use the phrase minting a DOI a lot to talk about assigning a DOI to a work. And a journal letter will say to me, well, I minted all these DOIs, but they don't work, it's just an error. And the other part is they have to register those DOIs at the registration agency. And there's a bunch of them. You need that third party. And the third party is kind of what leads to the persistence. So what's a registration agency? I'm asking you to remember our SimCity example again. Persistent identifiers are managed by registration agencies. There's a bunch of them, and they all follow a set of specific guidelines for the things they need to provide as registration agencies for PIDs. They're typically international not-for-profits. For one of these to be for-profit, pretty rare. They store the records and metadata that are registered. They facilitate those resolution requests. So when I click on a DOI, it's hitting a Crossref server, and Crossref is saying, here's where the URL is. They may or may not offer other services based on membership, and they do a lot of this through APIs. Again, we'll talk about that later. There are a lot of registration agencies. It's important to know that registration agencies differ between all of them in mandate, governance, scope, service, supported objects, membership terms, feature set. They're all a little bit different, and they're all also describing very different things. I would describe a publication in a very different way than I would describe a person or a data set or an institution. You can't use one metadata form to describe all of those things because all of those things have different characteristics. But they also often work together and share data between each other. Again. So let's review some of these registration agencies. So when it comes to scholarly works, kind of the big one is Crossref. Most scholarly publishers are Crossref members. At the time I wrote this yesterday at 1 p.m., Crossref had 134,294,189 DOIs registered with their service. That is an enormous amount of content. Crossref are a big deal. If you're making a DOI for a work, these are the different types of works that Crossref can adequately describe using their schema. So articles, proceedings, monographs, Data sets, their schema for data sets isn't great, which is why I put an asterisk here. Funding agencies, grants, reports, standards, and preprints. So if I'm publishing any of those things, Crossref is an excellent choice for me to have a membership to. DataCite. So while some scholarly publishers use DataCite for article DOIs, it's much more commonly used in data, institutional, or disciplinary repositories. DataCite and Crossref work together, for example, our research data repository here, Dataverse, uses DataCite to mint DOIs. That's where we do all of our DOI management, because the DataCite scheme is really good at describing software, datasets, collections, audiovisual, event, models, and publications. So they can describe publications, but their publication schema is bad, which is why DataCite tells people who are using it for publications that Crossref is probably a better choice. And Crossref tells people who are submitting data that DataCite is probably a better choice. They work together to make sure that the stuff is the best described. And they work together to connect research data to publications. So it's possible, using a service called Crossref Event Data, when I publish an article, I can check against the event data to see if that similarly matching metadata exists for a data set, and it can connect those two in the Crossref record. So that's scholarly works. For researchers, we've got 3, Orchid, Scopus ID, and Web of Science. Web of Science Researcher ID, I don't think is super commonly used. Scopus ID, pretty popular for the people who publish in journals that are in Scopus. You can connect them together. Orchid is the only one here that is an international not-for-profit. Scopus Web of Science, big time for-profit. So your mileage may vary. A lot of people in this space will include Google Scholar. Google Scholar is not a PID. It is a profile, but there's no ID associated with that profile. So Google Scholar isn't really one of these. Orchid are the go-to. So yeah, Scopus and Web of Science are both restricted to publications present on those platforms, but you can share data between them. I can connect my Scopus ID to Orchid or Web of Science or vice versa. You can push data between all of these. PIDs for organizations. The big one here is ROAR. Grid is actually on its way out or is done. There are good odds you'll never need to know what a ROAR ID is. Librarians may need to know, faculty don't, researchers probably don't need to care. This is one of these things that will probably happen to you more than for you. The predominant use case for organizational IDs is in strengthening connections between records using the open scholarly infrastructure we talk about later. So I'll give you an example of what finding research from UNB is like. So if I'm looking for research from UNB, it might be listed as UNB, University of New Brunswick, UNBF/SJ, UNB Fredericton, University of New Brunswick, St. John. It's written in a million different ways, which means locating research from our institution sucks because everybody describes their institution in a different way. A ROAR ID means that if I go here and that metadata has been adequately recorded, say by a publisher, then I can just find work from UNB. I don't have to search for these million different things to find different iterations. ROAR is very new and really just getting adopted. But ROAR is one of these things that will help make this connective tissue a lot stronger than it has been. Registration agencies provide metadata schema through which users can describe the objects they're registering PIDs for. So ROAR obviously has schema related to describing an institution. So it'd be like place, address, a handful of other things. Orchid describes who you are and where you work, and then has lists of your publications. And then DOIs describe the publications that you're registering. You can imagine that you would describe all these things differently. Even when agencies use the same type of PID, like the DOI, the schema may vary. If I submit something to DataCite, that form, the metadata they record, is different than what I submit to Crossref. They're asking for different things. I can describe things in a different way. So let's look at the registered metadata for the example earlier, the big chunk of XML. And I'm not asking you to be able to read it from where you're sitting, but there's a lot of information here. This is a Crossref record. I have a publisher, deposit and update timestamp, book type, contributors, and who the first author is and what the role is. Maybe they were an editor or a translator. That would also be recorded. Title and subtitle, publication date, the DOI for the book, the link for the book, the DOI for the chapter, the link for the chapter, and the chapter title. And that's just in this one record. This one DOI can tell me this volume of stuff. And I want to highlight here. So this is the section with the URLs in it. At the top, I can see DOI 10.4324, the timestamp for when it was uploaded, and then the resource, the link to where the book is. And then similarly, down here, where the chapter is, separate links, separate DOIs. So URLs are part of that metadata. When you change the location here, when somebody clicks the DOI, they go to the new place. This metadata is hugely useful. So unlike publications yourself, you're probably used to like hitting paywalls and not being able to access content in one way or another. Metadata is usually free. We don't have to pay for access to just publication metadata. So that means we can pass a lot of this information around and learn a lot from it. So Crossref can store all of these things as publicly accessible metadata: title, subtitle, author, Orchid's affiliation, copyright license, funder and grant IDs. They have their own control vocabulary for funder IDs. So I can ask Crossref's API to tell me who's got shirk funding and has a DOI, and I can go look at the products of that work. Languages, ROAR references, so all of the references are there. That's actually the use case for Crossref, is that when I submit a DOI, I include my references, and then they can see where people have cross-referenced each other, and then tell you who you were cited by. That's all part of the service of Crossref. Resource location version. So, is this the final version? Is it an author's accepted manuscript? Is it, one of these things? Publisher, journal, volume, issue, related DOIs, dates, and abstracts. So if you put your work in a preprint server and then the work gets published, Crossref gives a notification to the people who manage the preprint server, and they say, hey, this is published and it's at this DOI. Can you make this relationship explicit? Crossref makes all of this metadata available through a public API. This is public and free. People can use a Crossref API to pull down any of this information, assuming they know how to talk to an API. I will talk about what APIs are, but it's like impossible to not like just keep saying the phrase. So we'll talk about it in a second. Right here. So an API stands for an application programming interface. It's basically a set of rules for interacting with software. Think of it like a little like a translator working as an intermediary between two people who don't speak the same language. So one API at Crossref is written in a completely different language by completely different people than the one from DataCite, but they have to pass information to each other. So an API is a list of instructions for how to get data into or out of one platform, and that API communicates with the Crossref API, which tells you how to get things into or out of the Crossref API. It's like an elaborate handshake that both people know how to do in order to get you good stuff. APIs are like kind of hard to explain in a very rudimentary way. They're everywhere. So my calendar app, for example, tells me today's forecast, and it's accessing that information using the AccuWeather API. So they wrote a thing saying, for the weather forecast, take this person's location and hit this forecast for X days from AccuWeather. So that's how those things interconnect. When my watch vibrates because I get a text message, that's because Garmin's API is communicating with Apple's notifications API. These are APIs who are communicating with each other to send that information back and forth. They're how disparate systems built by different people using different languages and definitions find common ground and share information. Again, infrastructure. So all of this is open scholarly infrastructure. This network of APIs is like a municipal water system. It's increasingly relied upon by researchers and institutions, whether or not they're really all that aware of it. And almost all of open scholarly infrastructure is based around APIs and passing this information back and forth. Again, this. So open scholarly infrastructure is this network of scholarly research-focused open source platforms, service providers, and APIs that work together to share data, eliminate relationships, make research more discoverable. There's a URL here, openscholarlyinfrastructure.org. There's a group called POSI. It's Principles of Open Scholarly Infrastructure. It's a group of people who all work in this space who have committed to a bunch of guidelines, principles around open scholarly infrastructure, things that they're trying to do. So, share data between each other, make sure their code is open source, these kinds of things. One of the things that open scholarly infrastructure isn't is specific to open access. People ask me about this a lot. Open is kind of subsumed the narrative of all things that are open source or open access or open whatever. Open scholarly infrastructure is as beneficial for for-profit publishers as it is for not-for-profit publishers. So they don't care who they're working with. The openness of it is regardless of the access you have to the material you get to. But the code that shares all that stuff, that's open source. So people can use that code to get information out as they see fit. So they're a little bit different, distinct. So example one, Orchid. Let's pretend I'm setting up my Orchid account, which we'll go through in a bit. And I want to add my publications. So within Orchid, I can pull up a search and say check against Crossref, and it'll pull up a little Crossref search, and I can put my name in, and I can check Crossref and DataCite for any publications matching my name. It'll take a while to do this the first time, and it'll only work if my articles have APIs. There's no reason for my work that doesn't have an API to be in Crossref or DataCite because they're not registered with them. But for any publications I know are mine and have DOIs, the metadata, I can click a button and have it just ingested into my Orchid record. And I can just sort of do that for anything I recognize or know is my work. Our Orchid pulls all of that metadata from the Crossref API or DataCite. So you don't have to enter any of it yourself. You don't go like, this is mine, and then you go over and like type stuff in an individual field. It just sucks all the metadata in to where it's supposed to go. But now that I have an Orchid, that metadata, when I publish, gets included in the publication record. So it's part of the DOI. So when that happens, Crossref will be able to say, oh, well, we just got this new work and we know it belongs to this person because this is their Orchid. So we're just going to put it in their record automatically. And that person doesn't have to look around anymore to find out whether or not they've updated their publication. Any place I publish that has a DOI will just be, where I could include my Orchid record, will just be added to my publication record. And you can see how this would save you time, like at the end of the year when you're trying to make up a CV for grant funding or whatever else. I don't have to go fill out all the places they published, because if they had DOIs and I could put my Orchid there, it would just show up in my Orchid record. Automagical, we call it. Example 2, unpaywall. So I use unpaywall a lot because I like to find open access versions of works. So if I'm looking for an article I need, but the library doesn't have a subscription, which sometimes happens, we cannot afford everything, that is impossible. But I use this browser extension called Unpaywall. And the Unpaywall plugin will tell me if an article I'm looking for has an open access version I don't know about. It'll show a little icon in the corner. So if it's like green, I know there's an OA version of that thing. Unpaywall uses the DOI for the article I'm looking at. They can see it on the landing page. And Unpaywall indexes metadata crawled from institutional repositories, disciplinary repositories worldwide, and compares that metadata against the DataCite and Crossref APIs. And they go, oh, it's this one. Well, we know that's in this repository over here because we've already indexed it. This might be a preprint or an accepted manuscript. It may not be the final published version. That's what we typically have in repositories, is an earlier version of the article that isn't the publisher's final. But it's definitely a version I now have access to instead of something I didn't. So we get to leverage all of the work that librarians and OA advocates do, getting all of their work put in repositories by using this plugin to sort of dig up or unveil that work for us regularly. So that's really great. And that doesn't exist without open infrastructure. If I can't ping the Crossref API, or I can't pull that metadata from repositories which have made their metadata available to me, then none of that stuff happens. Example 3, funders and Orchid. So let's pretend I've applied for funding from an agency that has an Orchid account or an integration. That agency could push data to my Orchid account. So they can say, okay, well, you got funding, here's your funding ID, here's your grant ID, data sets, articles. They could push stuff to my Orchid record and pull stuff from my Orchid record. And the next time I apply for funding, I can just say, hey, just pull my Orchid, and then all my new publications are just in the thing. I don't have to go fill out 80 forms and do a bunch of backflips. They can just, oh, okay, we'll just pull the thing. It's got all the same stuff in it, and all the added material will be there. And because you've given them access to your Orchid, they can just pull that content down, whenever they need it. Open scholarly infrastructure really ties the room together. I guess that's what I'm saying. It's a way to connect all of these disparate things in general. So this infrastructure argument, I think, is really important. The idea that all of this stuff is interconnected. And I think about it because we also don't often think about the water system and how complicated it is. Like, it's really easy to just sort of dismiss the fact that when I turn a tap, I get water, and then like wastewater goes to a place, and I just kind of anticipated and expected. But when we talk about using DOIs or connecting all this stuff together, it is infrastructure. It matters the same way in modern scholarly publishing as roads do or water lines do. It's the stuff that makes all of this work get pushed around and shareable and useful. And we learn a lot more about this than we had for years. There's a lot of stuff we used to not really know about publishing that we can now see, obviously, where work goes. So, for example, say I take the best case scenario where my DOI that I publish for my work also includes my Orchid and my ROR. And then I can view a place where I can go, okay, show me all the work from UMB researchers. Boom, up it goes. Show me all the work from UMB researchers that got a CAHR grant who have data attached. Boom. Like I can start to see where all of these connections are. I mean, that stuff's a little ways out because everybody has to use them and publishers have to support them. But the potential of all of these connections being made explicit in the records that you also use to access the work is a really big deal. This is a friend of mine joked that this is a map of the inside of my brain, which doesn't feel unfair, but it's an indication of the kind of ways in which data sort of moves around. I know it's small, but say I've got software repositories or work for repositories from GitHub, those things can have DOIs. And those DOIs might be referenced in a data set. And that data set DOI may exist in somebody's Orchid. And that Orchid may be registered by somebody's organization. So they know I published that data set in a place. On the other side of things, that data set may go to somebody else's Orchid, which has like an identifier for where a physical sample lives in a lab somewhere. So you start to get this like very broad understanding of where all of these things connect. On the other hand, if I only have a publication DOI, which is down in this like lower left corner, I can find out who the researcher was and what organization they're at. And if a data set exists, I can go backwards. I can go the other way. So I can find all of these connections with just one piece of the infrastructure if all of these things are adequately connected. It's the water supply. Without the Crossref API, all of these examples kind of fall apart. 134 million records. That doesn't exist if I don't have access to that. All that goes away. Publications that aren't using DOIs are basically off the grid. Adoption in humanities for DOIs pretty low. Or certainly lower than the sciences where it's like expected and somehow a status symbol. Like there are people who say like, oh, I really need to have a DOI. It proves that I published. Like I like that people want DOIs, but they don't really mean anything. You can have them, you make them all day. The absence of these connections results in a lot of folks entering the metadata into systems over and over by hand or hiring graduate students to do this for them. We see this, when I fill out my update my CV every year here at UMB, I write it into a Word doc, and then they print that on a piece of paper, and they put that in a filing cabinet. I can't think of a more useless way to treat valuable metadata than by printing it on a piece of paper where you can't connect it to anything, where it's not searchable or any of these things. All this stuff is a great use of everyone's time. Every time somebody hires a graduate student to fill out their publication record, that's great. Such a beautiful, useful thing we're doing. So persistent identifiers, in concert with all of this, allow us to see this big picture through the connections and interactions. It can expose relationships between data and research and institutions and outcomes. It can make research outcomes more discoverable. When we talk about PIDs, we're talking about supporting open infrastructure and this free exchange of metadata. And metadata, I have to talk about for a second. We get so much out of these systems, and its utility is really dependent on its quality. So, if you've ever used Zotero or some other reference management software, and you pull the metadata down, and you go, "This metadata is trash." That's the publisher's metadata. That metadata is probably also in the DOI. So we have this kind of general expression in metadata, it's garbage in, garbage out. If you put in trash metadata, it doesn't magically get better when you pull that metadata back out. And there's kind of an onus on everyone, librarians, researchers, publishers, registration agencies, they all have a stake in usable metadata. And sometimes in a Crossref service provider's call, somebody piped up and they said, Crossref, why don't, this metadata isn't very good. Why can't you fix it? Like, well, we have 134 million records. It can't be our job to fix this trash metadata. Why don't you just get people to put better metadata in? Why don't we improve metadata literacy? So this is another thing I spend a lot of time on. It's very complicated. I could literally spend twice the time I've talked here today talking about the importance of metadata and what happens to it, recommendations for journal editors, these kinds of things. But metadata is really important. So if you're filling out metadata as an author, do your best to make sure that it's accurate. There's a lot of traditions or folk wisdom in publishing that people hold on to that isn't really helpful. Like that I listed before, M. Nason. It's very common in like geology, for example, for your citations to just be a first initial and the last name. That's just write the name. Like it's already better to have a first name, last name than this thing. And they only do it really because they've always done it. Which is like a very New Brunswick sentiment, but scholars do it everywhere. So it's a really important thing to kind of think about the quality of that metadata and make sure you're doing your best. But acknowledging that all the systems don't always let you do that. You know, if I'm an immigrant, if I'm like a Vietnamese immigrant and somebody asks me for my, given name, a useless thing to ask one of those like 4 names and they all mean a different thing. Not everybody can excel in that space. It's kind of everybody's job. Boy, could I talk about metadata. So I understand that this is a lot. We've run through a lot of things. I guess what I'm hoping is that you'll come away today with a little perspective, that a DOI is not just a thing you click and it takes you to the thing and that's all there is to it, but there's all of these other interconnections. PIDs aren't just links to things. They're not academic bit.ly. They're not status symbol. They're not permanent. This is a really important part. If Crossref goes away, that link stops. If nobody ever updates that URL, that link will never take you to where it is. They're not permanent. It's not a guarantee that you will find that work there, but it is better to share a DOI than it is to share a URL, which break way more often. And they also aren't magic. This is all stuff that people have really thought long and hard about making work the way it does. They are potentially huge time savers. Having all of that metadata get pushed around automatically, huge. People's time is limited, and they're often asked to spend more of it than they have. Useful for finding research. So, if I can get the Orchid record of somebody whose work I like, I can now see all of their publications because it's all in their Orchid record. And then I can view the DOIs for those things and go read that content. They're interconnected between services. This information is pushed back and forth. DataCite, Orchid, Crossref, and ROR all work very well together. ROR just got added to the Crossref schema, so that's pretty new for Crossref, but ROR is supported in Orchid also. And it really is the backbone of all of that open scholarly infrastructure. All of this stuff is super cool. So I guess thanks for listening to this bit. I hope it was coherent. I spent like 35 hours trying to make this make sense, which is 10+ hours per person attending, which is a lot. And I guess I'll ask before we move on and take a break at reconvene at 12:15. If there are any questions about persistent identifiers and this stuff, I'm okay with repeating the question if there's a question in the room for the one person who is listening on the stream. Is it still one person? Is it still just Alex? Hi, Alex. Okay, great. And if Alex has a question, Alex can throw it up in the chat. We got about 5 minutes for questions related to PID stuff. Sarah? Yeah, it can be, or it could be collected as publication metadata by the publisher. So instead of entering like an affiliation, which would be like such and such department of whatever, like maybe that still exists, but then there's a field for ROR. So the publisher would say, okay, well, pick your institution. And they probably wouldn't like give you the ROR or ask you to know what the ID is. You would pick your institution out of a list, but then it would assign the ROR to that publication. And then it would be in the DOI as well. RORs and ORCIDs are connected, so I believe you can have that be part of your deposit. So if that publisher takes ORCID, they can pull in the ROR, assuming they actually do that work. Any other
content of like the metadata that's in a DOI can be changed, but the DOI itself cannot.
Yeah. So at any point, I can update a DOI with that. So if a new version went up, traction, change to the title, post publication. So maybe somebody just had like a typo and they wanted to fix it, I can fix that. Or a new version went up, somebody with a couple fixes, you could add that to. Yeah, these kinds of things are all supported. You can change anything about a DOI, but you cannot change. You can mint a new DOI, and then register that. But then you have two that point to the same place, and that's called a conflict in Crossref. Crossref will say, these both do the same thing. Can you please tell us which one is the primary and which is the secondary? My worst nightmare was when I had a publisher who admitted an entire set of secondary DOIs, and then I needed to fix that problem for them, and there were like 400 that I had to manage by hand, saying it's like a tab delineated file that was like on one side it was the old DOI, on one side was the new DOI, and I had to do it manually for like 400 records. I did want to kill those people. Right. So I should have included a link in this thing. You can search. So for Crossref, it's like search.crossref.org, and you can put a DOI in, and then it'll access the DOI and it'll give you a couple different options. One you can do is load the JSON record. So JSON's like a metadata standard, or I guess a descriptive metadata format. And then you can also query the API directly if you know the commands for querying the API directly. There is some documentation at Crossref, for example, for how to query the API, but you can just like literally in your like URL bar put in a query and it'll just throw up the record from Crossref there. The ways in which those platforms allow API access are all a little different. Like I'll talk about it in the back half. Like Orchid has two APIs, there's a public API and a member API, and what you can do with those APIs are very different depending. DataCite, I don't really know much about their API and how open it is. I assume it's pretty open, but every one of these would kind of have different hoops you need to jump through to pull data. But Crossref is pretty easy to use, as long as you know like how to phrase the questions, so to speak. Part two. So this is going to be an overview of the services and features of Orchid, including information on, signing up for the service, adding your publications. All this stuff's pretty straightforward, but we'll go through a bit. We'll talk a bit about what an Orchid profile is, what the benefits are, if there are any concerns, and then we'll do kind of a quick run through of some of the stuff that's in Orchid. This is only about a half-hour session. We may fall short or a little over. I don't really know. We'll find out. So what is an Orchid profile? So an Orchid profile is basically an online academic CV. It's the best way to describe it. They can fill out information for employment, education, qualifications, invited positions, distinctions, membership, service, funding, and works, all of the things we are typically asked to put in our CVs when we submit. So committee stuff, guest editorships, your specific works, data, published data sets, all of those kinds of things. It wouldn't include course load and stuff, but these other pieces. And with an Orchid profile, you can control it as public or privately available to people, and I will show that bit. Orchid's free for anyone to get. You don't need to be affiliated with an institution, and they're kind of ideal for scholars who move between institutions because they have full control over what's in the profile and who can access it. So like if you're like a postdoc and you're kind of bouncing between institutions or you're having to provide publication information, it's actually kind of ideal because your publication record sort of carries through with you as you go. You've got a handy place to store all your publications, and it doesn't really matter who your employer is. You can use that same list in those many places. Sharing your Orchid ID allows someone to see everything you've set to public. So if I give someone my Orchid, they click on the link, they can see anything in my record that I've configured to be public. When you publish with an Orchid ID, it's displayed along with your name and affiliation. So at like an article landing page, it's pretty common to see a little green dot, little green ID. If you click that, it'll take you, or the Orchid will be displayed directly. You click it, you can see all of the publications in that person's Orchid record. It doesn't mean it's going to be all their publications, because it's the stuff that they've put in their Orchid record and the stuff that they've made public, but you can see anything that person's made public. And so when you publish, someone says, hey, I'd like to learn more about what this person's published before, they click your Orchid, they can see all the information that you want to share about yourself on your Orchid record. But because your Orchid's also stored as the metadata within the DOI, as we talked about before, Crossref or DataCite can push publication metadata to your Orchid when you publish. In your profile settings, you can set DataCite and Crossref as trusted parties. There's kind of language in Orchid about who you trust to write content to or view data in your profile. So as long as you publish somewhere that uses DOIs, you won't have to manually enter your publications into your profile. That rules for lots of reasons. So if I have an Orchid account and I'm using our instance of DataCite, and my Orchid's in my DOI that I made with their DataCite thing, that can automatically be added to my Orchid record without me having to double up all of this information in a bunch of places. That's great. That's very useful. You can share metadata and publications between Scopus ID or researcher ID. I know we have some people like the physics department, a lot of people in the physics department that like using Scopus ID. You can log into your Orchid and say, give me my Scopus stuff, and you can give them the information and they can pull that content in, and you can have them in both places. And Scopus can pull from Orchid also. A lot less people use the Web of Science Researcher ID. Scopus is a lot more popular. So you can use your Orchid ID to populate them or vice versa if one matters. So like Scopus ID is more like a community of practice. People publish in the places that you publish. Most of those places are in Scopus. So people may look for you there. But Scopus is journal specific, right? Like Scopus only really has journals, the data sets, monographs, proceedings. Those things may be more likely in other places. So Orchid will hold all of that stuff. Or, you know, funding information, these kinds of things. So in your profile settings, you can set Scopus and researcher ID as trusted parties. So in Orchid profile, it's possible to share your publication record using Orchid instead of submitting this enormous list of citations with people. This is increasingly common, if not required, by a number of funders worldwide. So for example, if I'm applying for funding at the NSF in the States, Orchid is a requirement of their application. That's how they want to receive your CD in your publications. You need to give them your Orchid ID and they pull the metadata in. There are whole countries, it's very common in the UK. You apply for funding and you provide all of your publication information using an Orchid. This is not something in Canada, especially as a requirement. None of the funders in Canada support ingesting content from Orchid yet, but they are looking into it. That sounds pretty good. And it is. Orchid's pretty good. The basic sales pitch I'd make to researchers generally, it's a not-for-profit profile service that serves as a portable academic CV and allows for some automation and metadata entry, and is increasingly used for grant applications or other administrative time savings. You're in control of it. The scholar decides who gets to see what, which is nice. That's not something scholars usually just get told what to do, not often get a lot of autonomy, but Orchid allows you to kind of configure what people do or do not see. It's easy to recommend, and it's very easy to use. You know, imagine what software that made a CV would look like. Just a bunch of empty data fields. You fill in the data fields. It's Orchid. really quite straightforward. Signing up is astoundingly simple. I would say it's easier to sign up for an Orchid than it is to sign up for an email address. They just want a little bit of metadata, and you sign up. It's not a big process. Metadata entry and correction, as always, takes a non-trivial amount of time. So one of the things I'm often asked is like, how do we get a bunch of researchers to put their stuff in Orchid? It's like I get them to teach a couple less classes because it's going to take them forever to dig through everything they've ever published and then add it to another thing for the 80th time. Like it's a non-trivial amount of time to add all your old publications. But any new publications, if you've got an Orchid and that place is a DOI, right up, no problem. It's easy peasy. So that part's really good. But just to note that there is a labor implication for stuff like, you know, Orchid mandates and getting everybody into Orchid. There are some schools that made the effort. I have colleagues at West who made the effort, or libraries are going to get everybody on Orchid, and librarians spent an incredible amount of time handwriting records into Orchid for people. You can like let somebody else modify your Orchid record, and they did like a handful of these, and they were like, "Yeah, we're not. This is an incredible waste of our time. Like, it's just an enormous amount, completely unsustainable." So scholars have control. They can dictate access to and from trusted parties. So again, control, easy to use, simple to use, can save a lot of time, a lot of plus sides to Orchid. What's a trusted party? I mentioned this before. Talk about this when you talk about APIs again, which is why I talked about APIs earlier. If you recall from part one, an API, application programming interface, is basically a set of rules for interacting with software, like a translator working as an intermediary between two people who don't speak the same language. Orchid has two. There's a public API, which is open. So you can write software that pulls metadata from the public API, but only exposes the metadata in people's records that is sent to public. Can't pull any other metadata. The member API, which is closed and restricted to organizations who are Orchid members. So UMB, for example, is an Orchid member. So as an Orchid member, I get access to the member API and I can pull information that is set to, what's the setting? There's like a restricted setting. So if somebody has access, they can pull your restricted metadata. But the author would have to give me permission as an institution to do that. I can't just do that because I'm a member. I have to ask that person if it's okay if I have that access to pull restricted content. So the member API gives me access to one layer deeper of restricted metadata than I would normally push to. And members can also write to a record, because obviously you don't want anybody in the public just writing to your Orchid record. That's bad. You don't want that just to be open. So the public API, you can't write. The member API, you can. A trusted party is an organization who's been authorized by Orchid to read private metadata as well as public, and to write metadata to a profile on the researcher's behalf. So Crossref, trusted party. There's an agreement between Crossref and Orchid. The Crossref isn't going to put a bunch of bad faith stuff in somebody's account or do things they're not asked to do. They can pull data from someone's Orchid if they're allowed, or they can push content to if they're allowed. That's what they do. They push content to your Orchid. The researcher has to individually allow a trusted party. The researcher has full control over external access via the member API, and the process requires consent. The author can also remove it if they want. So let's say in a universe where UNB could use an Orchid ID sensibly and I provide them access, and then I stop working at UNB, I can revoke their access as easily as I could add their access. So nothing about that is permanent. It's all in the hands of the researcher, which is good. These trusted party interactions, where an organization can leverage the member API for publishing metadata and private details, assuming the researcher says yes, are very often referred to as integrations. So here people say I have an Orchid integration. And it really just means that you can use your member API in the software you're trying to get content in or out of. Do we have one of those? No, UNB doesn't have anything. We do open journal systems, but that's not that kind of thing. Please tell me this can help with my CCV. It absolutely cannot. The CCV has no integrations with anyone. It doesn't have an open API at all and is not actively developed. So for those who don't know what a Canadian Common CV is, so when you apply for funding with the tri-agency, you have to fill out a CCV. It's a list of all your publications. And you do it in their online form. There's a couple different ways you can import content. It's miserable and buggy and not great. And not being actively developed anymore. Doesn't have any open APIs. It is possible to get your publication metadata from Orchid to CCV. I wrote a guide for how to do it. Orchid stores all of its records in a format called BibTeX, which used to be like if you use EndNote ever. EndNote stored its records in BibTeX. So it's the same language, just like a bibliographic record citation schema. You can pull all your stuff out in EndNote. And you have to do a little bit of hand massaging, but you can make it look exactly like a Google Scholar record. And they do ingest Google Scholar. So you just say, hey, it's a Google Scholar record. It's actually your Orchid record. Up it goes. So I made a guide for that if you're the kind of person who is inclined to open up an enormous metadata file and hand edit. Chemistry department, super thrilled about this. Most people not really going to probably do this. So that BibTeX piece does allow people to get content in or out of Orchid, but not super popular. I will note the tri-agency is currently looking for the successor of CCV. I put a link here. It's the Tri-Agency Grants Management Service team is investigating currently what will replace CCV. And they have a whole webpage describing the process and what that looks like. We can assume it will support Orchid ingest. It's a thing they know about, they think would like to support. But we absolutely do not know for sure whether it will. So kind of like an okay assumption that that kind of thing will be supported down the road, which again, if you're kind of looking to the future and I've just told you this is a lot of labor to update, might be worth poking at least a little bit. But it could be like 2 years or more before, because governments move at a glacial pace. So down the road. So why should I care about Orchid? Well, I mean, personally tracking publication history is good. And name disambiguation I talked about earlier. If you're a person whose name has changed, or you write your name in a lot of different ways, or you publish in a lot of different cultures where people write their names differently. If you transitioned and you've got a bunch of citations that are your dead name, but you still want to make sure they're adequately attributed to you in a way. Maybe that journal doesn't have a policy around editing metadata around dead names. These kinds of things. Then Orchid will send everybody to you, which is nice. That's a good reason to do that. Just name disambiguation alone is like kind of a big feature for a lot of people. For submitting citation information to member organizations that are trusted parties. So, if I'm like a co-applicant on an NSF grant with somebody who's applying to the States, they can just pull up my Orchid record and up it goes. Beauty. The UK also handy. Though there are no funders in Canada that do that, I am aware that sometimes people end up on funding applications for places that are not in Canada. So still handy. Also, again, a portable CV that some schools in Canada can use instead of a Word document for assessment or annual review. Those are significant investment in their CRIS systems, or like research information systems. Some schools can just ingest. So here, like if I had a rich Orchid record and annually ORS will say, or the HR will say, give us your CV. And at some schools, they just go, we'll just pull from your Orchid. They don't even tell you they're doing it, they just do it, which rules. And tracking information The Scopus or researcher ID do not track. Again, those are journal-specific services. There are a lot of things people publish or do or work on or get that are not specific to journals. I'm probably not going to put, I got a big grant, my Scopus ID. The work that I did as a result of that grant will be affiliated with Scopus, but not the grant itself, which I can put to Orchid. So Orchid tracks a lot of things. And again, you have control. And again, they're a not-for-profit. All of these things are kind of good, warm, fuzzy things. Orchid's useful for being, if you're being a modern researcher interested in saving yourself some drudgery. Down the road, I think the use case for Orchid is pretty good. It's best described as a bit of an investment. It will take time and effort to fully set one up, but ideally, in the not too distant future, its ubiquity will extend to Canadian researchers. I think this is like possible. It's like 60-40, 70, 60. Well, it depends on the day. 50-50 on most days. Like 60-40, 70-30 if I'm feeling good. The bottom line, so for researchers interested in Orchid may vary from discipline to discipline, career to career. Again, humanities, most of those people don't care about Orchid. I would argue they should, but they're not as into it as folks in the sciences who may be using this stuff regularly. Some are very on board into it. Some could care less. Some folks are concerned it's a little like being barcoded. It is a little like being barcoded. Having a single name associated with just you is that. But the beauty of this, at least, is you can revoke access, and you're in control of who gets access to that thing. You know, barcodes aren't like in a political metaphor, being barcoded is awful, but like as a thing that people use, barcodes actually pretty handy. So both of those things are true. The concept of institutions using Orchid to maybe get like a great big heap of metrics that they might use to evaluate your research, like that's the kind of boogeyman here. But again, if you can kick your institution off of your Orchid account and not let them pull from your Orchid account, then that they don't have that ability. And probably some of those institutions are just going to do that anyway. they're just going to try. They're going to try. So it is a little bit like that, and those concerns are valid. But at least in this case, these institutions, these researchers have control of who has access to what. Ultimately, it's worth noting that even if UMB did use a platform that supported Orchid, right now they don't, each researcher would have to decide whether or not to make UMB a trusted party that could see private information. So it's totally up to you, but would save you an incredible amount of time if you didn't have to, like, you know, go update a CV and physically print it out and mail it down the hill like it's, I don't know, the 1980s or something, the manila envelope. Everybody's smoking indoors. So I'm going to go over to orchid.org. We're going to take a quick tour of what's in Orchid. And that's my Orchid. I'll come back to the slide deck in a bit. But we're just going to take a quick, like, 10-minute what's what of Orchid. So this is my Orchid record. My Orchid record is trash. I don't publish. So a lot of this is just examples. But you can see the kind of stuff that exists here. So Orchid in the top, I can view my own public record if I want to make sure I can see what people have access to at any point. I can kind of to view my public record. I can see here in emails, I can list whether or not my emails are available. There's these three little dots here, and if I click on it, I can change it from, or sorry, if I click on the little pencil, I can change access. So the access options are everyone, trusted parties, only me. My email addresses on my Orchid are set to only me, although it's not like it's hard to find my email address, but that's what they're set to. And I can add other email addresses. I can make email addresses primary, these kinds of things. Websites and social links. So my homepage is here. A website I don't think I've updated in 6 or 7 years. Keywords. So each of the keywords that are related to the kinds of research I do, I've made these all open. You can see the little green dot. Countries, all the countries in which I'm affiliated. If I had dual citizenship in a place, I would list other countries. You can add to and remove. Anything with a little pencil icon, you can throw information up or down. Name. So this is where your name information is. So also known as restricted. You see I've got in this section all my name listings. So Michael Thomas William Nason, restricted. That's because I think my name is lame. Michael Nason, Hem Nason, that's where I tweet. Please don't. But I guess that's where the tweets happen. And I use it in a million other places that make me easily abusable. And then as a joke, Mike, Tom, Bill, Nason, all my names in shorthand, which I have set to restricted. So you can change any of these whenever you want, all the varying names that you go by. And then who can see your names broadly? Do I want people to see my names at all? We have a biography section. Mine's very brief. Liberian musician malcontent. But of course, that could be a larger biographical statement. You have all the space in the world to write whatever you want. Activities, employment. So I can add here, and I can also sort. So I can sort by title, start date, and end date. And I can add new ones. And I can edit existing ones. So I can show more detail. Sarah, your hand's up. Yeah, I can take the entire, well, a given name, a name is necessary. It's kind of the use case for Orchid. But I can restrict all names at the top level. So if I give someone an Orchid, it just doesn't tell them whatever name I've registered. Yeah, if you're like, if anonymity or no names is the use case, Orchid becomes like an unusable tool. It's kind of it's the thing that replaces names. So it like, yeah, they need at least one alias, but it could just be a handle. It doesn't have to be. So then employment, you can edit any of these and see the full, see organization identifiers. I didn't talk about Ringgold, but it was one of the organization identifiers. So actually I've got an org identifier for UMB here already. I talked about ROAR earlier. I could add the ROAR value. Other identifiers, ISNI and Orchid kind of use the same protocol, but another identifier for my institution here, added, last modified. So Scholarly Communications and Publishing Librarian, a title that has since changed 2015 to present. And I can see I also work for PKP, and that's here, URL date added source. And I can modify these whenever I want. So city, region, state, country, department, role and title, start date, end date, link, and then the visibility for each of those things. And these links just take you to that section more quickly. So you can update any of these. So this is my employment record. This is at least accurate. Education and qualifications, pretty standard. I've got my MLIS, I've got my MA, and I've got my bachelor's degree. And you can show more detail on these too. So again, the institutional identifiers for each of the places you got a degree from, added, modified, these kinds of things. And then within, again, organization, city, region, country, same sorts of things, degree, title, department, start date, end date, link, visibility. So you can do that for any of the things you add there. And then really where the stuff starts to pop off, invited positions and distinctions. So if I were to add one of these, I can pick, add invited position, add distinction. Let's say I was invited to be a guest editor, organization, city, region or state, country, department, role title. Maybe if I was asked to be a writer in residence or something, I would add that there. I want to add distinction, like associate dean or something. I could put I could put those in, or awards, membership and service. So I included, I'm the current chair of the Orchid CA Governing Committee, so that's here. Coalition Publica Technical Committee, that's here. And again, I can restrict this stuff however I want to restrict it. Same stuff, org, city, region, country, service, role title, that kind of stuff. So you can include this information for any of the stuff you care about in this space. Funding, again, pretty standard thing for people to put. You can search and link or add manually. So if I search and link, I can check against the Dimensions wizard, which is like one of the places you can pull content from. Dimensions is usually used as like a research management software suite, particularly in the UK. It's not as often used here. So probably not much of a use case there. Instead, you would probably want to just write in your funding by hand. Although they may, if you connect to the Dimensions wizard, have more luck. We'll see more of these get added as in North America, more institutions record this information adequately. We'll see more of the funding things be added automatically that way. And then where the rubber hits the road is works, where you add the varying things that you have worked on. So what I want to really show you here, so you can sort by all the things you would expect to sort by, and I can add. And when I add, I can search and link. I can put the DOI in, and it will just go get it from either Crossref or Untitled. So if I have a list of DOIs for my publications, I can just slap them in and up they'll go. If I regularly have my work indexed in PubMed, there are lots of publishers who will send a version of your publication to PubMed automatically without you having to do anything. So I can add a PubMed ID and it can pull in that publication. I can add the BibTeX record I talked about earlier, or I can add information manually. So add manually is what you would expect. It's a metadata form, title, journal, volume, issue, normal stuff. If I go to search and link, what I get is a list of places I can search and link from. So I can use AirED, which is the AirED service. I don't know it. Base, here's Crossref, here's DataCite, German National Library, Europe PubMed Central, HAL, ISNI, MLA International Bibliography, Open Air Explorer, Redalc, Research Data Australia, Scopus, I can pull straight from, or the Lens, that's like a patent scholarly knowledge. So you would probably know as a researcher where some of your stuff is in this place. And you click on the thing. I'm going to click on Crossref metadata search. So I've done a quick pop over. So now I'm at the Crossref metadata search, and it pre-populates the search with Mike Nason. And you can see none of these are me. Oh, I love this author name. Jakey Mike. Remember I talked about how important metadata is? It's a great example of what happens when people just jam stuff. These are both ads. Secure Way Autoglass from Syvy. It's pretty cool. So anybody can make a DOI, right? Like I can make an article and assign a DOI to it and assign metadata to that thing. I don't have to, like, you buy a membership. Oh, you mean Syvy? I think it's because Syvy is trash. There's a thing that sometimes happens with talk about like bad faith or predatory publications that will sometimes just like an ad will end up getting published, and then that ad gets assigned a DOI by whatever the platform is, and then it ends up here on a name search. Yeah, spam kind of ends up everywhere. It's kind of everybody's problem. I've definitely seen stuff from Syvy show up before. I remember one time I saw a thing that was like I don't know, it was like a weed tonics or something, and it was associated with a researcher. It might have been Bruce Balcom's name. It was like Bruce showed up linked to like weed research in Syvy, which was like an app. But it's just a search. Like I'm literally just searching the Crossref API for my name, not even in a name field, but just Mike Nason. So it's just giving me all of those things. So yeah, there's lots of reasons that might happen. There's a title called Gertrude Nason, which is a reference thing. Grown-ups, there's all kinds of stuff in Mike Lee, on Mike Lee. I'm gonna actually use Bruce Balcom because he actually publishes, so you'll get publications. Bruce Lee, Balcom. So like 1918 seeds and monograph. In any event, under actions, I can cite or I can view the metadata as JSON. I talked about that before. Let's look at a metadata record. This is JSON. It's very tiny. Metadata record. All the stuff stored against that record is here. Seeds that grow in northern Colorado. Prefix 105962. Balcom Seed Co. It's actually an institution. Given name WD Balcom. Additional. It's definitely not, but I can look at the record. Or I can cite the record. But you'll see the big important thing I'm really trying to indicate here is right next to this, there's a big link that says add to Orchid. And if I click it, it'll go right over to my Orchid record. So when I find my works in the Crossref search, maybe I know what they are, but I don't know the DOI. I can search them up and I can add them and they'll automatically end up in my Orchid record. For fun, I'll put this one about parental abandonment in here. That feels right. That's sad. Sorry, that sounded like much worse commentary than it really was. just having fun. Right, so I'll close this up. Yeah, these are the publications I've already added here. And that publication will show up if I refresh, I think. No, or maybe I left the page too early. Nope, there it is, parental abandonment. So I can add my publications that way. Pretty straightforward. And you can see here this little link icon, it's telling me I can make a copy of that publication, but it's telling me it came from another place. And if I open up this record, I can show more detail. It'll say source Mike Nason via Crossref metadata search, saying you added this here from Crossref. It'll tell you the sort of authority record. So if Crossref is writing content here automatically, it'll say that Crossref added that record to your publication. If you've added your institution and your institution's adding your publication, it'll be whatever name they're registered under. We'll see that they added the publication. Oh yeah, people can you can go hog wild and put like the idea here. None of this stuff prevents people from lying. I can publish fake stuff and put a DOI on it. This is one of the things we actually see happen a lot with journals. Is they'll say to it's like a bad faith journal and it'll have a big thing that says we're Crossref members, and it's like, yeah, anybody can do this. It's like $200 a year. You can be a Crossref member, and yeah, we're Crossref members. That means we're good. It's like, well, you just bought a thing, and then for everything they publish, they can register a DOI for $1, or maybe they're from a country that they get like a sponsorship deal. So maybe those DOIs actually cost them anything when they upload content. They can register that content. So there's like an assumption that you know what you're like. This stuff is as useful as the metadata entered and everybody's good faith in this space, but there absolutely is like completely packed fake Orchid records full of things that people just made up that they said that they did. There's still always going to be a human element that looks at a Orchid record and goes, well, that can't be right. Like, there's no way that's true. But you could do the same thing with a CV, right? When I hand it into I could hand in a CV to HR and say I did a bunch of incredible things that I didn't do. Whether or not it's worth the risk, it's probably not. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and lying to your funding agency is probably not a good call. Typically speaking. This is really, like, honestly, as far as Orchid goes, this is it. Like, what Orchid does, right? You fill out your metadata, you add things from other places. It's all very straightforward data entry. Everything kind of does what it says on the tin. Any individual publication, if I wanted to only have a trusted party see it, I could just click it. Now that thing that I'm the chair of the Orchid CA governing committee is restricted, and only people I've given access to that thing can see that thing. So you can always toggle who can see what. And anything that's set to public is set to public. So like I just restricted this, and in the top left, I have an option to preview my public record. And when I do that, it'll show me only the stuff I've set to public. So I had name data there that I set to restricted. So you can see it says AKA, and there are only 2. I only set 2 of those to be public. And then under employment, that's all here. Education and qualifications, but under membership and service, we no longer see Orchid. You can take a look and preview what's on your public record in advance, so you know what you're sharing. You don't end up in a situation where you shared something you didn't mean to, or whatever. But sometimes people say, well, like anybody. So I talked about public APIs. This API is public. Anybody can pull information from a public Orchid. Sometimes that really gives people the willies. They go like, I don't want somebody to know all that information. They're just restrict it. Like you don't have to share it. Like all of that stuff is configurable. Share the stuff that feels important for you to share, that you want people to see if they see your Orchid on a conference poster or publication. And then the rest is useful to the places that you can provide that metadata to. You can always pull your records out in BibTeX, you can export, and you can use your metadata in a different way. So it's not only usable to the people who connect, but if I pull all that BibTeX out, there are things that read BibTeX that can give me my CV in another format or something. Like it's not useless. There are a lot of resources, and I'll add to this slide deck some of them. Orchid made a great big like resources for researchers, like tips and resources for researchers, and I'll add it to the slide deck. It's a really nice page full of things that researchers would want to know about, what Orchid's for and what it does. But yeah, that's Orchid more or less in a nutshell. That also takes us to time. So I guess I'd ask maybe like a minute to questions about Orchid related stuff. I know that was a lot pretty fast, but if you need more information on Orchid, Orchid has incredible resources for explaining why it exists on its own website. They're all really good. So I do recommend taking a look at those.